Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. The Chennai International Center is very happy to welcome you all to this event, which is a book discussion on the book by Professor Karthik Muralidharan. Joining him in discussing the contours of the book, we have two eminent personalities. We have Mr. N. Ravi. A short introduction, though he doesn't require much of an introduction. And in fact, he has given me only two lines to read. He says he's a distinguished journalist and editor, former editor in chief of The Hindu. But you all know that he's much more than that. He joined The Hindu in 1972, he served in Washington. He was deputy editor and associated editor of The Hindu. He was editor from 1991 to 2011 and editor in chief from October 2013 to January 2015. He has wide international experience of covering the visits of prime ministers and presidents and international summits. His special areas of interest and writing include constitutional and political issues, economic policy, international economy, free speech, human rights, and India-US relations. He is the recipient of several professional awards, including the G.K. Reddy Memorial Award and the BREAD Role Model Award, and was awarded an honorary doctorate by the Sri Venkateswara University, Tirupati. Put your hands together, ladies and gentlemen, for Mr. N. Ravi. The other discussant is again an illustrious civil servant, Sri K. Ramakrishna Rao. He is Special Secretary Finance in the government of Tamil Nadu in Telangana. Sri Ramakrishna Rao is a IS officer with a remarkable career in Telangana's finance and planning departments. His distinguished academic background includes degrees from the prestigious institutions of IIT Kanpur, IIT Delhi, and Duke University. He possesses a unique distinction of having prepared, presented, and successfully executed all the 12 consecutive state budgets for Telangana. As Special Secretary of Finance, Sri Rao is a champion of fiscal responsibility, strategic resource allocation, and the delivery of robust public services. His visionary leadership has been pivotal in driving Telangana's economic development since the state's formation in 2014. Additionally, he skillfully oversees the state's reorganization department, demonstrating his ability to solve a variety of complex governance issues. He also has a deep involvement with CGIS in successfully implementing crucial reform initiatives within Telangana, which makes him an exceptional discussant for the book. Please put your hands together for Sri K. Ramakrishna Rao. And now to the hero of today's event, Professor Karthik Muralidharan. He is the Tata Chancellor's Professor of Economics at the University of California, San Diego. His research spans public finance and development economics with a focus on improving education, health, welfare, and public service delivery, and has been published in several world leading academic journals. He is also actively engaged in policy advising and capacity building in India at both central and state governments and in public communication of research insights through several op eds and podcasts. Professor Muralidharan is also the co founder and scientific director of the Center for Effective Governance of Indian States, CGIS, a non-profit organization that works with multiple state governments across India to improve state capacity, governance, and service delivery. Born and raised in India, he holds a bachelor's degree in economics from Harvard, an MPhil from Cambridge, UK, and a PhD in economics from Harvard. Please put your hands together for Professor Karthik Muralidharan. Now, about the book, well, the volume speaks for itself, and I would leave the discussants to take you through the contours of the scholarly work that Professor has put together. But just some excerpts from the blurbs. Professor Kelkar says, Professor Muralidharan's policy insights offered in this book are almost heaven sent for our policymakers. I hope they will just do it. Another from Nandan Nilekani. essential reading for anyone interested in India's development. It is invaluable guide for India's leaders and policymakers to drive national progress. Shri Vivek Debroy, this is a major contribution in an area often neglected and will make us think about reinventing the Indian state as we embark on our journey towards a developed India. So, and Mr. Our colleague TV Somanathan, it will be of high value to academics, practitioners, and any reader interested in governance, policy, and India's future. So, without further ado, let me hand it over to Sri Ravi to conduct the proceedings, and may I invite all the three onto the stage.
Dr. Chandramouli, Professor Karthik Muralidharan, distinguished civil servant Mr. Rao, distinguished invitees, members of Karthik Muralidharan's family, students and teachers of economics, distinguished guests. Actually, this book is virtually a magnum opus of Karthik, and we are all gathered to celebrate the launch, which first happened in Delhi and then yesterday in Bombay, and now today the discussion. The actual the proceedings will be organized this way. Karthik will first talk about his book, then Professor Rao and I will give our impressions, and then it will be open to for interaction with the audience. So Karthik, you can go.
Thank you so much. This is, the other launches were launches. This one is more of a homecoming, right? So this is, it's a great privilege and honor to be here, and especially to see people who have known and supported my work over many, many years. So, let me jump right in. As people have heard me talk, the hardest thing is how am I possibly going to finish in half an hour, okay? So there's a lot to cover. So, as we take stock of where we are, is the mic, it's fading in and out. It's good. See, as we take stock of where we are as a country, okay, India at 75, so 75 years of independence, entering our 75th year as a sovereign republic, there's many things to be proud of, okay? So we've kind of maintained political unity, for the most part, electoral democracy continues to hold. And in the global landscape, the Indian economy is actually doing reasonably well, okay? So we're the fastest growing large economy, and there's macro stability compared to even countries in the neighborhood or countries in Latin America. So there's many things we take for granted, but actually overall India's kind of macro fiscal management has been, remarkably prudent and sound. And then the combination of size, the demographics in terms of our youth, the democracy, and the diaspora, these are all factors that combine to kind of make India just an incredibly important player, both on the global stage as well as kind of, poised to take off, to improve the living standards of Indian citizens. But at the same time, we also face profound challenges, right? And these are incredibly, these are substantial problems on basic service delivery. So education, you've got 50% of kids completing primary school without being able to read at a second standard level, okay? So health, you've got the world's largest number of stunted children at about 35%, okay? Public safety is kind of, the police are overworked, understaffed, under-equipped, and only 10 to 15% of crimes even get reported. And justice, we've got a backlog of 30 million cases in our court system. Welfare, one way of seeing kind of the limitations of our welfare system is kind of the migration of literally lakhs of workers during the COVID shutdown. And then job creation is probably the single biggest problem that we face as a country. Okay, now, so every one of these are profound challenges, and all of these kind of hinge on the government being able to deliver basic services effectively. Okay, so if you were to kind of look at the overall simple story of the Indian economy, it's that the top 10% essentially drives the growth, okay? So you've got the top 1% that makes dollar salaries in kind of globally competitive sectors. You've got another 9% that has salaried income that is therefore stable and part of the consuming class. You've got another 30% or 40% that basically migrates to cities and essentially provides the services for the demand of that top 10%, okay? So just to give you a sense of this, if any of you who have domestic help, that domestic help is probably in the top 20% of the income distribution of India, okay? They can to give you a sense of where we are as a country, okay? And then you've got the bottom 50%, predominantly rural, okay, who are not even able to participate in the growth process that is kind of the modern Indian economy. Okay? And that's kind of what gives you the political pressure for welfare and redistribution, and that is kind of natural in a democracy. Okay, like I mean that there is a political process through which progressive taxation and a certain amount of welfare is what allows you to make that development more inclusive. The problem, of course, is that you cannot function at full potential without firing on all cylinders. Okay, so we're growing at 6.5%, but you can't do 8% or 9% or ideally even 10% if half your kind of population can't become active contributors to that India growth story. Okay, and the core of being able to do that is going to be better human development. Okay, so if half your children are graduating school from in rural India without being able to read, this is not just a moral failure, right? I mean, it's also an economic failure because you're wasting your once in a lifetime demographic dividend. And these are kind of every one of these issues is constrained by weak state effectiveness in delivering essential public services. Okay, so the point of departure of this book is that normally when you kind of have this discourse, the default kind of advocacy of the social sector is to say we need to spend more money. Okay, so everybody wants more money. But one of the main reasons for writing this book is to kind of highlight that the issue is not about spending more money. Okay, because in sector after sector after sector, you see that the translation of spending into outcomes is so poor, okay, that you really have to get into the black box that is the government and try to understand how do you improve the effectiveness of public expenditure. So that really is the core challenge, and that is kind of what this book is about. Okay, it is how do you improve the effectiveness of public expenditure, and that requires not just talking about what we need to do, but it requires talking about how we need to make these changes. Okay, so and the other thing is we also just don't have the money. So for example, education advocates like to say we need to do 6% of GDP, but that 6% of GDP norm comes from high income OECD countries that have a tax to GDP ratio of 35%. We are sitting at 18%. So as a share of budget, we are not underspending on education. It is as a share of GDP, but you can't do 6% because you just don't have that kind of money. So which means that there's no other option but to be more efficient with your public expenditure. Okay, so to get a sense of the scale of this problem. So here's a quote from Rakesh Mohan, who's one of the architects of the 91 economic reforms. And when he reviewed 25 years of reforms, this is kind of his quote saying, the way forward for accelerated growth in India is being held back by major governance deficits in all areas connected with the delivery of public goods and services. Okay, so this is really the key binding constraint. And Dr. Montek Ahluwalia, who's written one of the endorsements, he says the 91 reforms were easy because it required the government to get out of the way. Okay, because most of this was just don't do what you're not supposed to do and the market will take over. Okay, but the next generation is much, much harder because this is getting the government to do better what it has to do. And that is a problem that we really haven't applied our mind to, both as a scholarly and a practitioner community. And that's kind of, what this book is about. Now, Land Pritchett, who some of you may know, is always like, more colorful, like, about how he talks about these things. And Land in 2008 has this this is Land saying the weak performance of the Indian state is one of the 10 greatest challenges facing humanity. Okay, now this has to be qualified with the fact that the Indian state does very well in mission mode. Okay, so in mission mode, the Indian state is outstanding. It can run the best elections, the best vaccination campaigns, the best disaster relief. It can do Kumbh Mela. Okay, now what happens is you can do these mission mode things because these are time bound with well-defined targets, and you put all your resources of the administrative machinery to making that happen. But if you look at what it takes to deliver services day in and day out again and again, that requires effective public systems that function on a daily basis without kind of the crisis mode that happens in a mission mode. Okay, so and that's kind of where we are struggling. Okay, so essentially as we assess India at 75, there is perhaps no greater barrier to India achieving full potential for its citizens than improving the effectiveness of the Indian state. Okay, so that's kind of what this book is about. It's not just about the what, but also about the how. Now, why have I written this book? The reason is that if I was to summarize one key message out of all of my empirical research in the past 20 years, okay, it is the fact that the returns, as when we talk about budgets, even in the public discourse, even financial journalists who cover budgets, we focus mainly on the top line of budget allocation to sectors, but not on the bottom line of how that allocation is translating to outcomes. So if you look at the returns to investments in state capacity that improve the quality of the pipes, you find in study after study after study that the returns to doing that is 10 times greater than simply spending more on the top line of the budget. Okay, so and most of my work, my best known work is in education, where work for over 20 years. So in education, for example, where does most of our money go? Most of our money goes in pay commission increases for teacher salaries. Okay, so these are the unconditional salary increases that happen independent of performance, and that basically takes up 90% of your fiscal space. But you have these large-scale studies showing that that has zero correlation with effectiveness in the classroom. Okay, so it doesn't change anything in terms of outcomes. Okay, but even modest amounts of pay that are linked to performance give you a much higher impact. So the point is, it's difficult to do, but that is kind of where the low-hanging fruit is. Okay, now if performance pay is difficult, think about something even more basic, okay, which is supervision, right? So one of my earliest studies was a nationwide study. So where did I, somebody asked me, I think, like, sitting in California, how do you understand the innards of the bureaucracy so well? It's because my first field study was kind of studying a nationwide study across 20 states, studying teacher and doctor absence. And we go to the field, I've talked to BEOs, talked to DEOs, talked to, been to God knows how many schools across how many states. And, the issues you see again and again are that, basically we spend in RTE, okay, we spent about 25,000 crores a year to hire more teachers to bring PTR, which is pupil teacher ratio, from 40 to 1 to 30 to 1. Okay, so that was where we spent the money. But why do we spend the money? You spend the money so that the kids get more attention. But there's two ways to do this. You can hire more teachers, or you can reduce the absence of the existing teacher. Okay, so we estimate that the fiscal cost of teacher absence alone is about 10,000 crores a year, okay, using the 2010 salaries. Okay, so today that number is going to be even higher. So the question is, then what are the correlates of lower absence? The correlates are, do you have monitoring and supervision? So the schools that have had a visit by a supervisor in the past 3 months have substantially lower absence. But that requires having the block education officer position filled. And what you don't see from the outside is, see, on the outside, we see, why is the government not working effectively, right? But you have to get into the belly of the beast to then see, right, like, where does this dysfunction happen? And about 40 to 50% of positions of block education officers are often vacant. Now, why are they vacant? That requires understanding judicial issues. So it requires, there are all of these kind of basic plumbing issues of how the government works, okay, that people on the inside know. See, the good news about the book is every IAS officer I've read this saying, like, we know all of this, it's so good you put it in one place, okay, like, but those are the issues where filling those supervisory positions will often be 10 times more cost effective than simply hiring more teachers. But we don't do that, okay. Similarly, child development. So we know that early childhood development these are the critical years, okay, 0 to 5. Now, India has never lacked for policy intention, okay. So we passed a constitutional amendment 20 years ago guaranteeing early childhood education. Right to Education talks about it. 2013, there's an ECCE framework. 2020, NEP. So policy documents have been talking about this for 20 years, okay, but we still haven't done it because the most basic intervention that's required is staffing in the Anganwadis. So you've got a single Anganwadi worker who single-handedly handles all the home visitation programs, the maternal counseling programs, the nutrition programs, and early childhood education, while filling 14 registers of paperwork. And if you do a time use study, you find that even in Tamil Nadu, which is a high-functioning state, they spend about 38 minutes a day, okay, on preschool instruction. So what did we do? Again, my team is here, there's teams of various walks in life. There's the research side of my life, the policy side of my life, and I'll thank them at the end. But, we did this large-scale study in Tamil Nadu where you just put an extra Anganwadi worker in 160 randomly selected centers and study the impact for 2 years. And you find that not only do you get a substantial reduction improvement in learning outcomes, but also a substantial reduction in child malnutrition because you're freeing up the time of the existing worker to go focus on the nutrition task. Now, why do you need the research? Because then you can connect this with global estimates of saying the long-term return on investment of doing this is about 20 times the cost, okay? But we did another study of what happens when you simply increase the salaries, and that gives you zero impact. But where does the money go? Every time it goes to unconditional salary increases of incumbent staff as opposed to using that same money to augment capacity. Okay, so these are little examples, okay, of sector after sector. So then education was my early work. The last 10 years, I've done work on NREGA. Okay, so this is again a large scale, and this is why it's appropriate that my main discussant is Finance Secretary from Telangana, because a lot of my work over the years has happened in the unified Andhra Pradesh. Okay, and so this was again a study done across 8 districts in Andhra, where we find that the biometric smart cards that reduced leakage in NREGA the ROI was over 10 times the cost of the intervention. Okay, so farmer welfare in Telangana, a flagship program of the Raitu Bandhu scheme, where the chief minister said we're going to distribute this money to farmers. So what did we do? All we did was set up an outbound call center, and that call center made 25,000 calls to farmers in a 2-week period, measured whether they got their money. And the important thing was the Mandal agriculture officers were told, Mandal is the block, that your performance is being measured by directly talking to the farmer. Just having that information led to a significant improvement of payments and money received on time, which was 100 times the cost of the intervention. So the point across all of this is, if you're a private investor and I tell you that there is 10x, 20x ROI in so many basic things, you'll be like, where can I put more money, right? If you're a private equity guy, you'll be like, boss, I need to put all my money in this. But as a society, we are chronically underinvesting, okay? Like in these basic governance reforms that will give you these huge returns. And in fact, one of my favorite examples is a recent study by Manaswini Rao. So she's a Berkeley PhD, was a postdoc with me for 3 years. And this is in the context of our courts. Okay, so everybody kind of talks about 30 million cases, and the backlog every year is increasing more, right? So the flow is higher than your ability to take care of it. So what she studies is just the impact of an extra judge in a district court. Okay, and every extra judge not only clears an extra 200 cases, but you get an increase in total economic activity, increase in credit outflow, and you estimate that the total return in economic activity is 30 times higher, than the cost of filling that judicial vacancy. Now, why is that? Is because 70% of the cases are either land or credit. Okay, so these are your critical factors of production that are being locked up without being used because they are stuck sub judice. Okay, so these are all then cases of kind of the plumbing of governance that, if you paid attention to, would give you a very high ROI, but we don't do this for a wide variety of reasons. Okay, so the biggest motivation for this book is really to pull together all of this body of evidence to then make this case for why the ROI on investing in state capacity is so high. And chapter 2 talks about why we haven't done it, okay, but that's really the core point. Okay, now one of the other reasons we haven't done it is, the honest truth is that the reason India's elites and middle classes don't worry about this is we have all seceded from being recipients of government services. Okay, so every person in this room has private schooling, private health, private probably security, private water for sure, maybe private air, okay, by air filters. Okay, so essentially elites have completely seceded. Okay, so there's a very nice study that shows that the government services that have improved, what has improved? Airports have improved. Passport services have improved, right? So the things that improve are the things that are also used by the elites, okay? But the services that are not used by elites have kind of been chronically underinvested in, okay? But one of the subtle points from the research is that this agenda that I'm talking about is not just a charitable welfare agenda, okay? One of the most interesting sets of results is that the elites will also benefit, okay, from improving the public system. Why? Because in any given market, we find that the quality of public and private is highly correlated. Okay, so Tamil Nadu has high quality healthcare, Kerala has high quality public healthcare, but they still have private healthcare, right? But the private has to be better than the public because the public is free. So essentially what happens when you push up the public quality, the private is forced to improve, and you get this cascading effect down the quality distribution, and we've got some beautiful studies that document that. Okay, so the returns to improving quality of public services is twofold. There's a direct benefit to the poor who use the public services, and an indirect benefit to the middle class who benefit from this cascading effect, okay, which we see in the data, which is often not seen. That's in chapter 9, okay, in the state and market chapter. Okay, so let me kind of take a step back, okay, and think about, because the book really has 3 very different purposes, okay, and that's why it's really only 600 pages, I promise you. There's 200 pages of notes and references, okay, and it's easy to read. But it has 3 very distinct audiences, okay. There is one part of this that is speaking to the intellectual community of development economics itself. There's a second part that's speaking to any citizen, non-specialist. You should be able to pick it up and read it because it's written at the level of an op-ed in a business standard, okay. It's not written in a very technical way. And the last audience is the government, because it gives you a roadmap of what exactly to do. Okay, so the point, what I want to do on the first point of the intellectual discourse on development is, see, for 50 years, the biggest kind of debate in development can be summarized in this picture. Okay, so this is that every development outcome, whether it's life expectancy, education, infant mortality, whatever you look at it, is strongly positively correlated with GDP per capita. Okay, so rich countries do better on everything, and in India, rich states do better on everything. Okay, so broadly, what you have in the global development discourse is you have the growth wallas and the development wallas. Okay, so the growth wallas will basically say, guys, in the long term, growth trumps everything. Okay, so 2% faster growth every year for 20 years is transformative. Okay, so get the growth right, everything else will take care of itself. Okay, so that's the growth side of the equation. Now, on the other hand, you have Amartya Sen, who very famously said that the purpose of development is not GDP, because you can't eat GDP. The purpose of development is to improve human capabilities to live a more empowered life with greater agency. And therefore, the goal of development should be things like education, things like health, that allow you to live a more meaningful life. Okay. So what they will say is that if you look at these positive outliers here, like say Vietnam or Sri Lanka, or within India, that will be Kerala, that you don't have to wait to get rich to get developed. Okay. So one striking fact here is, if you look at Sri Lanka and the US, in the year of COVID, Sri Lanka had a higher life expectancy than the US, even though the US has 15 times higher GDP per capita. 15 times higher. Okay. And that's partly because the public health systems in Sri Lanka, like are so strong. Okay. So similarly, in India, if you look at the cross-state pattern, Tamil Nadu and Kerala will systematically outperform, okay, where they are on that income graph. So this, and broadly speaking, this is the Bhagwati Sen debate, right? Or in India, you can call it the Gujarat model versus the Tamil Nadu model, okay? So the Bhagwati Sen debate is that, the growth wallahs will say, do the infrastructure, do the capex, and that's what you need. The development wallahs say, let's do social sector. Now, what is my point of departure in this whole book, okay, which is that, see, at some level, both of them are right, okay, because more growth gets you more development, because you can spend more on health and education, but more human capital gets you better growth, because that feeds back into growth. So a big part of the China story or Vietnam story is they've invested in better primary education, better primary health, and that's kind of why the capital also moves there. So you also benefit from that, okay. So my point, so at some level you need both. So what is the debate? The debate is one of budget allocation and the direction of causality. Okay, so in general, what happens? The center right normally focuses on infra and capex. The center left normally focuses on the social sector. So this debate ends up being quite an ideological debate, because it reflects those differences in values. Okay, so my point of departure in this book is to say, boss, we spend all of our time fighting on budget allocation, but the quality of expenditure is horrendous regardless of what you spend it on. Okay, so whether it's not like somehow capex is better quality of expenditure. If you look at the CAG reports and time and cost overruns on most of our capex, we have poor quality of expenditure even in capex. Okay, so the simple point is to say, how can you do more of everything? You can do more of everything by kind of investing in the quality of expenditure, and that allows you to do more of everything, and you also get this positive feedback loop, okay, from development back into growth. So, and this is consistent with, in fact, the macro development literature, right? Where if you look at cross-country variation in GDP per capita, about 20% is physical capital, 20% is human capital, 60% is productivity. So similarly, what I'm saying, the growth wallahs are focusing on the physical capital, the development wallahs are focusing on the human capital, and I'm trying to focus on the productivity of public expenditure, because that's where the highest return is going to be. Okay, so that's kind of situating the book in the intellectual landscape of development economics itself. Okay, now, it's easy to say this. All right, so now how do you be optimistic? Okay, what is the reason to be optimistic? The reason to be optimistic is that if you look at this picture, this is one of the great triumphs of development of the 20th century. Okay, so what is this? It's basically showing you, it's plotting life expectancy at GDP per capita. This is 1930, this is 1960. Okay, so this is called the Preston curve, named after the demographer Samuel Preston, who wrote this paper in 1975. And the basic idea is that if you look at this curve, in 1960, it has shifted up. Okay, what that means is at the same level of GDP per capita, 30 years later, countries are able to deliver much better life expectancy. Okay, and what is driving that? It's new technologies, okay, that you have that you did not have 30 years ago. So the most striking example of this is 100 years ago, the son of the president of the United States, okay, Calvin Coolidge's son, died from a simple blister on his toe. Okay, the most simple bacterial infection, the son of the president of the US, they could not do anything to save. Okay, whereas 40 years later, 50 years later, a daily wage laborer like him would get low cost antibiotics and you'd be able to save him. Okay, so the point here is that most improvement in the human condition, like has come from the creation of new knowledge, the transmission of that knowledge, and acting on that knowledge, okay, at scale. So this is the case to be optimistic. Now, why have I written this book? Because we have a tradition in health. There's a strong tradition in health of doing high quality evidence synthesis and acting on that. But in the last 20 years, we've now learned so much more in so many sectors, and this is driven by the explosion in research. Okay, so in the last 20 years, you just have so much more data, so much more computing power, the push to experiments. So you have much better evidence on things that work and things that don't. So where is the free lunch? The free lunch comes from that there's just enormous opportunities to identify what are the very, very expensive policies that have little to no impact. And if you can cut your spending there and move your spending towards the very, very inexpensive interventions that have huge impacts, that allows you to shift that Preston curve. Okay, so that is kind of what the core intellectual point of the book is. And if you see why this matters, this is all chapter 10, okay, where if you look at infant mortality in 2021-22, we are still at 35%, okay. Now, if you grow at 6% GDP per capita for the next 25 years, if you project based on whatever time series elasticity has been of how much we've reduced this in the past 15, 20 years, you will still end up at 25% stunting in 2047. Okay, so this golden period, this Amrit Kal that we talk about, okay, if you continue on the current trajectory, even at 6%, okay, now this is not a super pessimistic story, right? Because if I show you what's happening with learning outcomes, Pratham has been measuring this for 20 years. Okay, and in 20 years of independent measurement of learning outcomes, there has been only a glacial improvement. Glacial. Okay, despite substantially increasing budgets on education. Okay, so if you look at that projection, in 2047, in the current rate, you will still end up with only 84%. So there's 16% of kids who will graduate in 2047 still not being able to read. Now, sorry, what I forgot to mention here is that even if you manage to grow at 8%, even if you manage to grow at 8%, this guy only bends to 22%. Okay, and that 8% in some ways is a max on what you can do by increasing budget allocations by 2% every year on 6% growth. Whereas if you manage to double the effectiveness of expenditure going forward, which is the elasticity of income growth into outcomes, if you double that elasticity, then you end up bending this curve here even at 6%. And by doing that, you get this hopefully positive feedback into growth from better human development that increases the chances that you'll do 8%, right? Because you're now actually firing more engines to come back and contribute to the growth story. Right, you see that? So given where we are, given all of the headwinds we have, what is the free lunch of how do you accelerate development? Is by improving the quality of expenditure to increase that, the translation of spending into outcomes. And that allows you to bend this curve much more than even growing faster. And that's because there is so much inefficiency, so much inefficiency. So when we think about public money, one of the things that a lot of people end up thinking is, the first thing people blame is corruption, okay? They say, oh, this is because of corruption. But there's many high quality studies that show that only 20% of the waste in government is corruption. The remaining 80% is inefficiency. Basic, simple, low-hanging fruit. And I can give you many, many, many more examples. Okay, so there's a lot we can do. Now, why does this matter so much? Because if you manage to kind of bend this curve, right, we're talking about accelerating. So why is the book called Accelerating Development? It's about that you don't need to wait till 2047. You can start doing this much better, and particularly for stunting and learning outcomes. Why? Because these children are not born yet. Their future is completely in our hands. So often politically we try to focus on skilling and jobs, but at 18 it's already too late. But the problem is 18-year-olds vote and 5-year-olds don't. So 18-year-olds are more of a pressure group than the 5-year-olds. Okay, so we build year after year after year of, of children who, that is every cohort that we don't pay attention to is another 10 million kids. Okay, so if you integrate across this, if you stay on our current trajectory in 2047, you're still going to have 200 million more kids who will graduate primary school without being able to read. Even if you magically take growth rate to 8%, that's going to be 160 million. But doubling that elasticity lets you bring this down by almost half, even at 6% growth, right? That's the doubling. Now, doubling seems heroic, but remember, I'm giving you a whole bunch of ideas that are 10x ROI. Okay, and I'm also being very conservative by not assuming improving efficiency of past spending or existing spending, because the politics of that is very difficult. This is just improving the efficiency of money going forward. So this is doable. This should be doable. Okay, so, and then if you get that feedback loop to 8%, then you get this to 80 million, and that's 120 million more kids who have completed primary school being able to read. Now, this is the grand narrative of what we want to do. But that's not what the core of the book is. The reason it's a book, the big book, is about how do you do this? Okay, and that requires you, in the words of Devesh Kapoor, to not look at the state as an institution, but look at the state as an organization, which is how does this function within the beast? So there is this black box of how budgets go in and outcome comes out. But most of my research over the years has been kind of doing field level work that connects it to the expenditure and tracking those fund flows to see where all it breaks down. And so what this book then reflects is the ability to kind of open up that black box and saying what are the systems we need to build to improve the effectiveness of the Indian state. So to do that, before I get very technocratic, so these are two chapters I'm very proud of, okay, because the core of the book is the middle of 4 to 16, okay, but these two chapters in the so the first intro chapter is just what I broadly told you, okay, that's kind of the lay of the land. But the second and third chapters are saying, listen, it's very easy. Most people sit and saying that politicians blame politicians and bureaucrats, but nobody actually understands the kind of pressure and burdens that these actors work under. The kind of pressure a politician faces is just unimaginable. Like just last month, I was with the finance minister in Telangana. There must be 400 people there. 400 people there looking for some kind of favor or the other. The bureaucrats have it better, okay? You don't have the same kind of pressure, but you still have the pressure, of what? How many lakhs of crores of budget you're in charge of? Like one file is wrong and there's the CBI, CVC courts and CAG, right? Like the 4 Cs. So compared to all of them, the academics have it easy, right? We have the time and the space to do the research. So it becomes a public obligation for us to actually synthesize that and provide some frameworks for what we need to do. Okay? But the point of these two chapters, which is critical, is to say that, listen, nobody is evil. Everybody is responding to their incentives and constraints, okay? And you really have to get into the systemic incentives and systemic constraints for each of these actors, and then understand, instead of focusing on people, you focus on systems. So that regardless of who the person is, that the system will do better for the citizens. Okay? So those two chapters kind of set the scene for understanding the innards of the state. And then you've got the 6 core chapters of what it takes to build an effective state. Okay? And a lot of this comes not just from economics, but also comes from management and organization theory. Okay? That the things that drive the culture of any organization, whether it's in the public sector or private sector, is what are the outcomes that are being measured? What is being tracked? What determines your promotion prospects? What determines your pay? What determines your postings? The personnel management is one of the most important aspects of org effectiveness and something that we completely neglect. And then where does your money go? Okay, so that's the chapter on public finance and expenditure. And then the 3 things that a government does that are different is you also have taxes. So how do you think about not just quantity of revenue, but the quality of revenue? Okay, so how do you raise revenue without distorting economic activity is something that most kind of income tax commissioners have their targets. So we have to raise this money. Nobody is thinking about the downstream consequences of different tax instruments. So occasionally you'll have a Kelka committee that will do that, but there's a lot of principles here, that apply to how we think about the quality of revenue collection. And then when it comes to governance, one of the key challenges we face is federalism and decentralization. So one thing most people kind of get wrong is we think about China and think about China as this very strong centralized state. But in practice, if you look at total public expenditure, in China, over 50% of total expenditure happens at the local government level. In India, that number is 3%. So India is one of the most over-centralized countries in the world. And that itself reflects a bit of a colonial legacy, okay, which I won't have time to talk about now, but you can go read that. But these are basic plumbing issues of how the government functions. So one of the reasons you have an absenteeism problem is the local guy can see that the teacher is absent, but doesn't have any authority to act on it. So in general, service delivery in most countries is done at the local level. Okay? So these are then again deep plumbing issues that affect every sector. And then there's the question about how do you deal with markets. 50% of rural primary education today is private in urban India. 70% of health is private. So how should the government leverage private actors and optimally leverage them in the public interest? So all of this requires a lot of conceptual clarity. And so every chapter is structured as what I call half is science and half is engineering. Okay, so the science is saying, as a social scientist, let's understand the facts, the principles and the research. And the engineering is how do you use that understanding to then build better systems. Okay, so that's kind of the first half of the book. But I could have stopped there. There would have been enough for a book there. But the reason there's the second half is that most people don't care just about this. People actually care about development. So the whole point is to say that you can't really develop without building these systems, or you can't accelerate. This is the binding constraint. So when Rakesh Mohan says this is the binding constraint, when others say this is the binding constraint, it is one thing to say it, but the contribution here is to get into it and say, so what do you do about it? Okay, and then for each of these chapters, then these 6 critical areas. So why do I pick these 6? Because these are all, so education and skills, health and nutrition, police and public safety, courts and justice, social protection, and jobs, productivity, and economic growth. Why? Because these are all core government functions. Now, the last one is a bit more subtle. The last one is more subtle because the government doesn't create the jobs, but the government is the enabler of the entire economic environment in which the jobs are created. Now, why do I pick these 6 sectors? Because going back to the growth and development debate, see, in India, Amartya Sen famously wrote about the argumentative Indian. Okay, we love to argue. Okay? So, but a big part of what I'm trying to do in this book is, boss, there is a huge area where we can agree and then just act. So the point about focusing on these things is you don't have to choose between the Senian view and the Bhagavati view, because every one of these things is intrinsically valuable because it gives you a better individual quality of life. That is the Senian view, that what matters in development is capabilities. But every one of them is also instrumentally important because they feed back into faster growth. So that will also contribute to the Bhagavati view. And that's what allows you to do more of everything. Okay? So hence the focus on those 6 sectors. And then the last 2 chapters are then about making it happen. So part of what I argue here, okay, is, see, sometimes it's the reason I put, earlier I was going to put this chapter at the end, but the reason I put that in the beginning is some people were reading and saying you can look like a very over-idealistic economist, like, you have to deal with the politics. And my simple answer on the politics is very simple, okay, is that I believe, and many people believe, that the politics is changing in a way that supports this agenda, okay, which is that as education is increasing, as information is spreading, that the demand for governance is increasingly high. So there is a traditional politics of identity and polarization, and there is a modern politics of governance and service delivery. Okay, so I'm not saying that the traditional politics is over, but that traditional politics only gives you 20%. Okay, that next 20% requires you to deliver. Okay, and you see that in election after election after election wherever you are in the country. Okay, so you need that extra 20% of delivery, and that then provides political incentives to focus on this. Now, the problem is that the politicians do this by saying, let's pick a few flagship schemes, put good officers there, and then campaign on that, but not necessarily fixing the entire system. So the way I describe this is that, think of the Indian state like a 1950s ambassador car. Okay, so just like that car was the metaphor of pre-liberalization Indian economy, similarly, we have added more and more and more expectations on the state without investing in the capacity of the state. So the way I want to make this agenda completely non-partisan is to say the political parties are competing in which direction to drive the car, but the car is barely moving. Okay, so it's one thing to kind of, the political strength is winning elections, the bureaucratic strength is running the government. But system design is meta, okay? It's even more than kind of just running a policy or making a policy happen. It's kind of taking this 10,000 foot view to say, how do all of these pieces come together? And that's what this hopes to contribute. So part of my point is to say that even under the current incentives of the politicians and the bureaucrats, they should want to implement this agenda, okay? But at the same time, let's not delude ourselves that many of the pathologies of our public life comes from the divergence of interests of the elites and the public. So then the question is, what can we do to kind of reduce that divergence, right? So then that comes back to reimagining institutions to better align and put constraints on elite behavior. And finally, in the end, the politics is downstream of society. And so, you can't expect better governance unless society itself demands that, okay? So that's then what can every individual actor who might read this book be able to do in terms of contributing to this goal, okay? So that's kind of the roadmap of the book. Now, how am I on time? Am I probably already horrendously over? Okay, 5 minutes, okay? So I just want to give you one example, okay? So yeah, so school education, right? We spend about 750,000 crores a year, okay? And the budget keeps going up, but there's basically no increase, okay? No improvement. So I'll just give you one example, just one very, very, very simple example, okay? Of something we've done that was well intentioned, okay? So we said as part of kind of universal education, we will expand schools to within 1 kilometer of every habitation in the country, okay? Now, what that has given you is, in mid-90s that may have made sense, but today that has given you so many subscale schools that you have lakhs of schools in India that have under 20 children and are being taught all 5 standards by 1 or 2 teachers, okay? So this is bad for governance, bad for pedagogy, bad for cost effectiveness, and bad for social integration, okay? So why do we do this? Because it's bad for governance, because most of the absence happens because it's a remote school and nobody can go there. It's bad for pedagogy because of multi-grade teaching, that you have 1 or 2 teachers simultaneously teaching 5 standards. It's bad for cost effectiveness because you have a minimum of 2 teachers, so the cost per child in that small school is 75,000 rupees compared to cost per child of 30,000 once you've achieved a scale of 150. And it's bad for social integration because of the social stratification by caste of communities and hamlets. Every school becomes kind of segregated by caste as opposed to schools being a space where you create a public spiritedness of common citizenship. So, it is relatively straightforward given the investment in roads that we have to say that just having, and NEP says this, right? Like, having slightly larger consolidated schools that you then have a bus to kind of move kids to will allow you to do better of everything, okay? Now, this is a gradual process. We will get there eventually. But the point of a book like this is most of this is known to people in the system, right? It is to accelerate, and that's the title, okay? So that's one example. And then, the other thing I like to talk, so this is a picture which some of you may know, okay, but I want to highlight the importance of research, okay, and so what is this picture showing us? I consider this one of the most important pictures to understand education in India. So this is about 6,000 kids in Rajasthan across 4 districts where this is the grade in which the child is enrolled in. This is the learning level, okay. Now, if the kids are making progress as per the rates of the curriculum, then they should be on this 45-degree line. In practice, the average kid they're proceeding at about half of this space, okay. So the average 8th standard kid has about a 4th standard level of maths knowledge, okay. Now, this by itself is a problem. What is even worse is that every dot in this picture is about 10 kids, okay. So what that tells you is that in my 8th standard class in Rajasthan, I have kids in 2nd grade level, 3rd, 4th, 5th, 6th, 7th, 8th. And that's because of our no detention policy that kids have just been pushed through all the way, even though, so that you can have them sitting in 8th standard with a 2nd standard level of understanding. And so that makes the teacher's job essentially impossible, right? So you can have so one part of the problem is absence. But now think about the highly motivated teacher. So what you're doing is you're teaching the curriculum, teaching the textbook, teaching the syllabus, you teach and you go back. But that is not reaching most of the kids. તો અત્યારે આ સેશન વચ્ચે હું બીજું ભાષામાં આમ વાત કરું તો ક્વોલિફાઈડ પ્રોફેસર છું, બહુ મોટિવેટેડ છું, બધાને સામે હોમવર્ક આપીશ, ગ્રેડિંગ કરીશ. પણ મારા જેવા જેટલા પણ પ્રોફેસર હોય કેટલા લોકોને સમજ પડે છે? હાથ ઉપાડો. 2, 3, 4 હશે ત્યાં પાછળ. શું કરું છું? તો હું દિલ્હીમાં વાત કરું તો ત્યારે એમની જોડે હું તમિલમાં વાત કરું. અહીંયા હું ચેન્નઈમાં છું તો બીજી ભાષામાં વાત કરવું પડે ને. તો આમ મેં કેમ કરું છું? શું કરું છું? So what I'm doing is I've just given you 30 seconds in the shoes of a typical kid in a typical school in an Indian classroom. Okay? That it doesn't matter how qualified I am, how motivated I am, how sincerely I'm teaching. If I'm teaching 6 grade levels above, I might as well be teaching a different language. Now, the reason the research matters is that if you're in the private sector, as an economist, I don't worry about how Toyota produces cars because you face market prices for inputs, you face market prices for outputs. So if you're not competitive, you get competed out. Whereas in the government, you can spend taxpayer money badly for a very, very, very long time. There is no market test. So the value of the research is especially high in that setting. And that's why we do the research, and that's why we synthesize it this way. Okay. So that's an example of that picture. And then, I'll stop. I'm probably out of time. There should have been a clock. But again, one of our most polarized debates in the public discourse is welfare. Okay. So we say, okay, politicians are giving out freebies and trying to get votes. And then it's very common for tax-paying elites to think that this is kind of buying votes for taxpayer money, and conversely. But again, what I want to say is that if you look carefully at public expenditure, you can classify them as interventions that improve efficiency, interventions that improve equity. So there are some things that are good for both, some things that, so a good example of a policy that improves efficiency but is bad for equity would be a uniform GST, okay? So every public finance economist would say uniform GSTs are going to be much, much better because you just don't have the administrative hassles of doing that. But it is regressive because that means the poor are going to pay higher taxes, okay? So that's an example of something that sits over here. On the other hand, you can have interventions like the PDS that are good for equity but potentially worsen efficiency, okay? Now, reasonable people can argue about this based on your ideology. But the problem is that we have so many policies that are bad for equity and bad for efficiency. So, probably the single worst policy in the country is free electricity for farmers, okay? The worst, right? Because literally the top 5% of landowners get over 50% of the public spending, okay? So, it's bad for equity. It's bad for efficiency in terms of what it does for crop choices. It's bad for the environment. It's bad for sustainability. It is a disaster. But we do it under the name of farmer welfare. We call it welfare. Okay. On the other hand, you have programs like NREGA, which the research shows are not only very effective in terms of equity, because they're well targeted because of the work requirement, but it also has a positive multiplier effect on demand by inputting money in the hands of the poor. So this is a paper that we just published in Econometrica last year. It's probably the most important paper I have ever written. We worked on this for over 10 years, and it kind of highlights the multiplier effect of kind of putting money in the hands of the poorest of the poor. Okay, but again, the point is the research then helps us populate. Each of these points here reflects kind of a body of evidence that underlines each of these programs, but eventually if we do that, we can do much better. Okay, so let me stop here and just say that there is a lot in this book, but hopefully like the discussants will assure you that it is accessible, and that you should all that you should all read this, and hopefully you'll enjoy this, and then we can all be part of this journey together. So thank you.
Thank you, Karthik, for that bird's eye view of the book. In fact, a book like this would probably have taken much longer, but you did it in good time. Actually, I would request Professor Rao to go first. He has had a great deal of experience in implementing policy and has done the reforms of the kind that Karthik mentions in the book.
Thank you, sir. First correction, I'm not a professor, neither a doctor. So, Professor Karthik and I have known each other for more than 20 years now. He walked in as a young PhD student when I was Commissioner School Education, and then said, look, we'd like to do this pay for performance kind of a thing in the schools. Then apparently I told him, I forgot, but then he remembers that, do you know, are you trying to do something which has never been done in the public sector in India? Pay for performance is not something which we don't do in the schools. But nevertheless, he said, we are going to do this, and then we worked out a way of doing pay for performance in some schools. For the first time, he told me about RCTs. So, we were very excited, and then we did that work. And then ever since, somehow or the other, his work has been in United Andhra Pradesh, now, of course, in Telangana also. So this book is like, it's like Gita, has exactly 18 chapters. Okay. And I have inflicted this book, because he gave me the manuscript and a few of my close friends. So we are at various stages of reading. My wife reads, Gita very diligently. Multiple times she has read. But right now, I am in chapter number 4. Okay. But that does not mean that, I have not gone through this book, because many of these ideas he has picked up from his wonderful lectures, which he has given on the Indian economy, Econ 164. So that is a series of 20 lectures. So many of these ideas were there. The basic foundations are there, but I think he has developed these ideas. And then we in Telangana have been very, very lucky to have him right from the day one. So I'll just give two clear examples of how his work, how his ideas have influenced the state. And then later on, if anything else is there, I will add to them. So the first and foremost thing, when we were struggling was, we had a chief minister who wanted to do something definitely for the rural areas. So he said, look, everybody talks about decentralization, giving money, etc., etc. But then, it doesn't happen. So what do we do? So we're looking for ideas. So we had 12,769. I still remember the number of Gram Panchayats in the state of Telangana. We didn't have the functionaries. First we said, look, let us take the functionaries, the Panchayat secretaries. But then the problem with Panchayat secretaries or any government functionary, the day they join the government service, they stop working. So therefore, how do you make them work? So therefore, then we posed this problem to Professor Karthik at that time. This was just about CGIS was being formed and then things like that. So he said, look, at the time of recruitment itself, let us have this condition that it is conditional kind of a recruitment. We are not going to regularize all these people just like that. Of course, probation is there in the government, but it's automatic, right? You're always assured of the government job the moment you clear the exam. But here was one exam where we conducted, where we said, you're not going to be automatically absorbed into the government unless you perform. But then the problem, is that, we have to put together a performance management system. But then how do you do that? So then we started working on that. Then, we worked very closely with Professor Karthik and Sejis. And then we were able to put together a very nice, simple app whereby the activities which the Panchayat Secretary is supposed to do within the Gram Panchayat, we were able to really quantify them, measure them on a daily basis. And we use the technology to get the reports on a daily basis. And then we also put together the supervisory structure, the so-called supportive supervision. So because the technology is available, so the next level of officers, they would go, they would find out whether these people are telling the truth or not. And so that kind of a structure we were able to build. We struggled for about 6 months. We put together the system. About 10,000 Panchayat secretaries were recruited. And after 3 years, based on the performance of this kind of a daily measurement, we only regularized about 80 to 85%. So remaining 15% of the people, we cannot throw them away. But then we said, probation is extended. So this is one wonderful idea, which he tells about in the book, about how do you improve the quality of public expenditure. Ultimately, you are spending a lot of money. The biggest money that is spent in the government is on salaries and wages. So how do you ensure that these folks work? How do you use the technology? How do you put together a system in place? So the performance management system, so I can definitely proudly say in the case of Telangana, whatever may be the metrics Government of India uses, at least 40% of the awards which Government of India gives for the rural areas, we get them. Year on year, we keep on getting them. 40% of the awards. This is in spite of several, mission after mission coming and then checking whether these guys are reporting the truth or not. But because the strong system that we have been able to develop, we have been able to get that. So that's a wonderful, very good example of practical application of some of the ideas that you have spoken in the book. The second one is a little more difficult, but we are halfway through that. That is from chapter number 4. That's basically outcome measurements. Many of the graphs are there in the book. You can see that. Many of my senior colleagues are illustrious senior colleagues are here. Sarkar mein always this fudgification happens. You want a report, you'll get a report whatever you want. Ultimately, they will say that आपको क्या report चाहिए वो बना के दे देंगे. That's the main thing. Sarkar mein, irrespective of whatever is the truth. So therefore, obviously, we need to have a fairly good system, independent system, to measure the outcomes. So therefore, the chapter number 4 talks about the data, outcome measurement, etc., etc. So we wanted to do the KPI survey, basically the key performance indicator survey. And then we put together the whole thing. We put together a tender document to select a technical agency, etc., everything. But then it took me more than 2 years to shepherd it through the system and get the approval of the Council of Ministers as well as the Chief Minister. But the clinching point was, on one day, I was sitting with the CM, and he was looking at some survey data which he was using for his selection of the candidates for the assembly elections. Then I told him, sir, you are using this for your assembly elections. We want to do the same thing. Sarkar mein hi hum karna chahte hain. Then he said, okay, then you go ahead. Then bring me the proposal. Next cabinet, it was approved. And then it costed us 10 crores of rupees to do this high quality survey. 65,000 families. We have 33 districts in Telangana. More than 300 different kind of indicators, very high quality indicators, plus or minus 3%. We've been able to complete that survey within a period of 6 months. Now we have accurate information about educational outcomes, health outcomes, nutritional outcomes. So this obviously contradicts what the administrative data says. Therefore, we are using this. With the change of government, I took this opportunity to say that, look, things are not as rosy as the previous government said. So this is the alternative data that is available. Now we need to push money more into these areas, these programs, these particular geographies. So I've been able to use that. Now the present government has become a big champion of that. Now they want to repeat the same thing year on year, again and again. So this is the first time that at a state level, based on the principles which are again exposed in the book, we have been able to put together this entire system, 65,000 families, pregnant women, lactating mothers, and then children, educational outcomes were independently measured. Anthropometric measures were taken. It has taken us about 6 months to do this thing, but then the results have been extraordinary and very, very insightful. So these kind of ideas, the number of other things which which are there in the book. Therefore, why I came all the way from Hyderabad is that this book is as much of a first-class academician and theoretician's insight into the way development happens, as much as a practitioner's insights. So it's a rare combination because normally we have academicians, who are typically ivory towered. Maybe they get Nobel Prizes, maybe they advance the knowledge and science, but then ultimately, as Professor Karthik was telling, when half of the country is not able to get any benefit out of this development, then are we really doing development? And finally, I would like to conclude by saying, because Telangana, many of you might not be aware, when the state was formed in 2014, I was very, very fortunate right from the day one. I've been finance secretary, I've been planning secretary, and we're in 2024 now. When the state was formed, we were number 10 in the country in terms of per capita income. Today, March 15th, MOSPI has released the latest data, as per which we are now number 2 in the country in terms of per capita income. I'm not saying the whole credit goes to Karthik or his book, but nevertheless, a lot of, innovative ideas, lot of reform ideas, a lot of, hard work. We have been able to build upon the insights which they were able to generate from the book and from his work. Because it's always easy, because, it's very difficult to counter, politicians when they come out with crazy ideas. Because he keeps on telling that the best thing is how do you kill all these crazy ideas, because common sense is very uncommon, right? Common sense is very, very uncommon. How do you ensure that the politician is nudged towards the right ideas? I think we have been able to do that in a large measure in Telangana, based on Professor Karthik's work. Therefore, I thought, even though I'm not qualified to speak on any of the other things that he spoke, but because I've seen the things which work in the field, based on his ideas, I thought, I wanted to share some of these things with you. So thank you very much for giving me this opportunity.
Thank you, Mr. Rao. Your perspective, as someone who has put into practice many of the ideas in this book, has been very valuable. I am more an outside observer rather than a practitioner of development or a scholar. I have known Karthik from his brilliant undergraduate days at Harvard, and this book marks a significant milestone in his journey as a scholar and researcher. In fact, for a serious book like this, I dare not ad-lib. I crave the indulgence to refer to my notes. I wouldn't say this is the culmination of his journey as a scholar and researcher, as he has much more to contribute, but this work has all the trappings of a magnum opus. Economics as a discipline is becoming more and more specialized, and often one comes across books focusing on a very specific area or topic. This book of Karthik's is a grand sweep of the entire gamut of economic policy, and there is little that he has left untouched. The sheer size at 812 pages is indeed daunting, but unless one is a scholar or a researcher, one can virtually ignore the last 200 pages of references and footnotes. For a book on a normally dense subject like economic policy, this makes very easy reading as well. The book focuses on strengthening systems and doesn't talk about personalities or governments or ideologies, but it focuses only on systems and gives specific suggestions on how to change things, how to change the way things are being done. As I see it, Karthik has already explained the specifics of the book, but let me just pick up a few points. A running thread through the book is a vital task of strengthening state capacity. That the point that he demonstrates over and over again is that while democratic demands from below have widened the scope of state action, the state's capacity has not been strengthened. Such strengthening is essential for delivery of services, including health, education and welfare, infrastructure building, development, law and order, and justice delivery. The basic approach of the book, as I see it, is to identify from his study and his own research data and findings that could be usefully applied to policy making, as Mr. Rao has just pointed out. The data and findings at times call into question some common public perceptions. For instance, on the widespread view that there are too many government employees, he points out that India has one of the lowest number relative to its population, 16 per thousand of the population, in contrast to 57 in China, 77 even in the United States, where the government is supposed to be hands off the people and the economy, 111 in Brazil and 156 in Norway, which is more of a welfare state. Again, on corruption and leakages in public expenditure, he points out that corruption accounts for less than 20% of the wastage, while inefficiency is a predominant reason for wasteful expenditure. Again, on the question of what has been called freebies, many tend to view freebies and unmerited subsidies as the result of vote bank politics of unthinking politicians. On the other hand, they are rational actors who respond to the system of distorted incentives. A precocious democracy came before development, and the democratic pressure from below prompts politicians to divert scarce resources to specific vote banks, even narrow vote banks, to win elections in the first past the post system, where even about 20% of the vote, 20% of the electorate can vote you to power. Karthik points out, along with Pranab Bardhan, that the three biggest elite groups who have captured state resources are big business, large landowners, and government employees. The case of free electricity supply to farmers in Punjab, for instance, highlights the fact that the indirect cost of such subsidy is much more than the budgetary allocation. In fact, Professor Soumya Swaminathan is here. She'll be able to enlighten us much more on this. It encourages long, wasteful, water-intensive crops, depleting the water table, and leads to issues such as stubble burning and pollution. A recurring focus on the book is on ensuring the efficiency of expenditure. The general tendency, as Karthik said, in addressing underfunded sectors such as education and health is to increase budgetary allocation. In fact, a far more cost-effective way would be to improve the efficiency of expenditure. He has already spoken about how to improve education outcomes by better monitoring of teachers and so on. The book, however, as I see it, is not one unending lament on what is wrong. It strikes a positive note and gives specific suggestions on how to address the problems. He points out that there is already a visible change with political leaders in the center and in the states beginning to talk of a grand goals on the future size of the state and national economies, and India becoming a developed country and so on. With the spread of literacy and education, the public may be demanding growth, jobs, and better delivery of basic services rather than handouts. The widespread use of technology, as in the case of the Jan Dhan accounts, Aadhaar, and mobile telephones, for instance, could be a game changer, contributing not just to service delivery, but also to the ease of doing business and monitoring the efficiency of expenditure. In fact, I won't go beyond this. In all, I would say this work is a grand and ambitious project, and Karthik has achieved his goal in a substantial measure. My congratulations. In fact, now it's time for audience interaction.
Hello, my name is Sandhya Jayachandran. I run an NGO called Samskriya. I work a lot with government schools over the last 10 years. And I followed what you had said earlier also with great interest. And I'm talking specifically from the education viewpoint, since we've been working for so long with government schools. What we find is that when we put in teachers who are paid quarter of what government teachers are paid. They still perform much better because there's accountability to us and better training. In fact, the government spends crores on training. At least here in Tamil Nadu, I don't know about the rest of India, they pay literally crores. But the incentive to improve is not there because there's accountability is lacking. Like what you said earlier, the elites have seceded from the public education space. So the first time generation learners have come into the schooling system, mass education is taking place, and capacity building is so essential for the teachers. One, but the teachers are not interested because the salaries are there anyway. As you said, supervisory, the IAS officers know what the problem is, but the middle level officers are again, they go there, they do the work, tick off the boxes, but beyond that, they don't know what to do. And there's an unwillingness on all sectors about how to learn and how to do it better. Because ultimately, they don't feel answerable to the public because they feel these people don't know anything and we know better. That is one problem. I'd like to know how you would like to address that. The second one is desirable outcomes. I was so impressed with what Mr. Rao had said about what he had done in Telangana. I'm sure that was a great fact of the ideas you had given and what he had done as a planning secretary and a finance secretary. It's remarkable. Again, here is where, when you say as desirable outcomes, when we have a flawed education system that still focuses on rote learning, what happens is desirable learning does not take place. Essential learning does not take place. Rather, the teachers, it's convenient. It's a factory system where made for the convenience of the adults and the education system, not for the convenience of the students. So unless there's a change on both the factors, where then outcome has to be, the measurable outcomes have to be changed, the parameters have to be changed for that, as well as accountability parameters have to be changed. So that is so essential for better delivery. So I'd like to know what you think can be done from the government side, the willingness of the government to do it.
Thank you for a wonderful explanation about the book, and it was really heartwarming. And I've been in service for 35 years, so I can understand the other side of it. I think this work is actually tip of the iceberg, and we need much more work along these lines. One of the points, maybe Rao will agree with me, but it's not just improving state capacity. I believe, and I have worked in many departments, that there is a lot of potential even among the existing employees. And the reason why they are not performing to their potential perhaps requires another study. She mentioned one point about accountability, but I have found that many are willing to take responsibility and no responsibility is given to them. It's not just a question of accountability. Harnessing the potential of human resource in government, I think, requires a far greater research, probably more micro studies than what is known today. Secondly, I will tell you a very interesting example. Many years ago, I was looking after the state of Jammu and Kashmir from Delhi. And there was a big problem in the Leh-Ladakh area. The Leh-Ladakh area, there was a cloud burst, right? And there was a huge damage. And the Prime Minister had ordered a special program in those days in order to ensure that Ladakh comes back to its normalcy. So I used to visit there. And one of the most strangest thing I heard from one of the local councillors, which really shook me, he says, "Sir, your all India policies for contract management is based on assumptions of tropical climate. Whereas we are a temperate climate here. You should look at contracts, how it is done in Mongolia and other places, and have similar systems in Leh Ladakh." So these are geographical differences which call for different kind of solutions. India is a big, rich, diverse country, as you have mentioned it. And I think each state requires a state-specific method of achieving all that you have said in the book, including human resource capital. Tamil Nadu is different from Telangana. Telangana is different from the now Andhra. So there are issues, but there are also local variations which requires greater and in-depth study. Thank you very much for this opportunity.
Let me take two, otherwise I'll
yeah.
forget because.
Okay. Saying that how much of your prescription is universal?
No, I think, see, I didn't plant any of these questions, okay? But the good news is, no, the good news is this is all in the book, okay? So everything, so this is I think one of the nicest endorsements I got was from Dr. Rajiv Sharma, who's the Chief Secretary Telangana, who also had a PhD in Carnegie Mellon, so he's, and so I think his first reaction, I think he told Kyarkesa that how could a professor sitting in California understand the innards of our government so well? And I think part of it is because there's this lovely quote in the Financial Times that says the best economist is one with dirty shoes. Okay, and that's because of all the field work and the time spent, right, understanding exactly these levels and levels and levels of where things happen. So I think, so let me answer you first. And so if you notice the subtitle of the book is called A State-Led Roadmap for Effective Governance. So one of the things I did not have time to cover, I'm just scratching the surface, is that one of the other unique things about this book is that the focus is 90% on state level actions, because all of our policy discourse is still excessively Delhi centric, right? Whereas all of these issues are constitutionally state subjects. So school education, primary health, law and order, district courts, they're all state. So, but our kind of intellectual ecosystem is so focused on Delhi and this standardization problem is huge. So the chapter 8 on federalism and decentralization is exactly discussing these issues, right? Where I just remind people that India has more people than the entire Western Hemisphere put together, more than North America, Central America, South America put together, right? We don't have kind of a government of the Western Hemisphere that tries to kind of micromanage everything. So I think we have completely forgotten the first principles of federalism, right? So if I take a 2-minute detour, right? So one of the mistakes we make is that we think about government as hierarchy. Okay, so if you think about that in that section, how does the size of a government or size of a country affect the quality of governance? Okay, so, and it turns out that there are trade-offs of being big, benefits of being big, and there are costs of being big. So the benefits of being big are you get economies of scale in defense, you get economies of scale in foreign policy, you get economies of scale in market size. Okay, so these are areas where size is good. But the cost of size is that if you have to accommodate the entire country with one policy, the more variation there is, the more suboptimal your policy becomes. And the cost of size is that the distance between the policymaker and the citizen keeps increasing. And so then the speed and responsiveness also falls. So the idea of federalism is to kind of locate the functions that require economies of scale at the center and functions that need to respond better to local information at the local level. So that is so one of the mistakes we make is we think of federalism as a hierarchy, whereas federalism is really thought of as difference in functions, where in different functions, different governments have primacy, where the primary goal is not who is in control, the primary metric is what is good for citizens. And so we need to rethink a lot of that. And again, there is a colonial legacy, there's a legacy of the independence movement that explains why India is so over-centralized, and all of that is discussed, but I couldn't agree more. The second thing I want to highlight is that, see, we talked about accountability, but again, so the good thing, see, what I did with the book is it took me about 20 drafts. Okay, so after about 10 drafts, it has been read by some IAS officers, by a couple of journalists, by academics, by civil society people. And partly it is to kind of reflect the entire spectrum of perspectives on what it takes. So it is still written by me, but the point is to make sure I'm aware of blind spots, that I may have missed. So one of the things in the bureaucracy chapter, you'll see, it's called the bureaucracy's burden. Okay, so one of the problems, if you talk about just accountability, we're getting it wrong. So if you think about high-performing organizations, okay, for people in the private sector, high-performing organizations provide autonomy on process to the frontline worker because you are close to the problem and you are empowered to fix it with accountability for outcomes, okay? So you are held, it's not like you have a complete free reign, okay? You have autonomy on process and accountability for outcomes. In government, we do exactly the opposite, right? You micromanage on process with zero accountability for outcomes. So in that process, you beat out the enthusiasm and the motivation of people there are. So 6 out of the 7 items in the bureaucracy and personnel chapter have to do with capacity, autonomy, and bringing out that latent strength in the people that is kind of being squeezed out by the system. And even the accountability piece, the problem is if you frame the discourse as accountability, it is dead on arrival because then it is an adversarial conversation between the administrators and the and the employees, and then it will not work, right? So you have to reframe this in terms of saying this is good for you and good for citizens. And that's why, again, the Telangana example is so important, right? See, what is the core challenge of state capacity in India? And that's why the personnel chapter is probably one of the most important chapters, because it cross-cuts all of this. A core challenge is we don't have enough people, but the ones you have are not accountable enough, okay, and are not effective enough, right? So it is like this quote I have there from the Woody Allen movie, right, of these two guys in a restaurant, and they're complaining about the food. And the first one says, the food here is miserable. And the second one says, and the portions are too small. Okay. Uh, so, and that is exactly the story of the bureaucracy. Okay. Like, which is at one level, it is too small, but at another level, it is also ineffective. So simply increasing the size in its current form is not going to do the trick, right? And so that's what makes this a wicked problem, because you need to expand along with reform. And that's why the Telangana example is so important, because see, there's a very interesting point here, right? Politicians normally think about public employment more from the perspective of the jobs you're providing rather than the services that are being provided, because the jobs are a visible immediate benefit that you can take credit for, okay, whereas the services are a long-term thing. But what the Telangana example highlights is the fact that that political calculus is changing, right? I mean, so the CM instinctively understood that I need more people, but they need to be accountable, okay? So, and that's why that is a really powerful role model that can be used in many sectors across the country, because you need more staffing, but you need more kind of both capacity and accountability. So it's that delicate balance, right, which is in that chapter. So, and you're absolutely right? In fact, one of the areas, so most of my work is education, but education also provides the best lens into public sector personnel economics, because it is the one sector where you can measure productivity. Because I know every year in Andhra Pradesh, we tracked 40,000 children for 5 years, measuring learning outcomes every year. And I know which teacher you had each year. Okay, so you can measure the productivity of an individual teacher by saying what learning level did a child come with at the beginning of the year and what have you left with. So in the public sector, measuring individual productivity is very difficult. So from a research perspective, a lot of what we've learned about public sector personnel economics comes from education. So this is me being a nerd, but that's why there's 200 pages of references. So the 600 pages you can read if you trust what I'm saying. And then if you're a PhD student or want to say, okay, let's go learn more, there's 200 pages for you. So anyway, so I think, I hopefully answered your question as well, because it is not, yeah, absolutely, right? I mean, there is capacity, but you have to, and then there's a deeper point. The deeper point here is every serious IAS officer knows everything in this book, okay? There's nothing here that is new to you, okay? There might be some things that are backed up by research, okay? But the difference is it takes what is kind of the knowledge that you have with your buddies, like after work when you're catching up, and makes it into common knowledge. And when it's common knowledge, that then provides you a framework to say, okay, this is now something that we can create certain reform roadmaps around. And that's what has happened in Telangana. Now, I need to say one more important thing, which is there are two organizations I have to acknowledge, right? I didn't do all of this on my own, okay? And so there are two particularly important organizations, right? The first is JPAL, which is the Poverty Action Lab. So when I said there are three parts of this arc, right? There's the creation of knowledge, there's the synthesis and dissemination, and there's the downstream action, correct? So JPAL has been the primary vehicle through which I have done the research, right? So that's the entity that Esther and Abhijit won the Nobel Prize for, and we do these large-scale RCTs. And then the book, in a way, see, most of the output that we professors do is written in peer-reviewed journals that takes 5, 8, 10 years to write, okay? And so that is kind of lost in that world. And so this book is about, so if I can take a moment to talk just about research. See, the problem with research is there's a lot of bad research, okay? So if you're a policymaker, when you sit and look at research, you can easily find for every issue, there's a study that finds X, there's a study that finds minus X, and you'll say, I have no idea how to use research, okay? So research is useless. So the point is that you need the judgment to sift what is the right tail of the research and then synthesize those insights so that this becomes actionable. And then the other organization, which is what also I founded 5 years ago, which is the Center for Effective Governance of Indian States. So CGIS is a non-profit. So very broadly, this is like the book is trying to lay out an intellectual roadmap for what we need to do as a country. And CGIS is trying to at least put some skin in the game of saying, let us not just do this at a theoretical level, work with the reform champions in the government and support to make these things happen. So that's what we've been up to.
Karthik, I think it's been very interesting, but I think we are run short of time, and Dr. Chandramouli is already up there.
I'm sorry. This discussion can go on, and I'm sure the way the audience is lapping up whatever is being said, you would like it to go on, but seeing the constraints of time, well, let me share with you that my first interactions with Professor Karthik was probably 2-3 years ago, when some of the chapters came to me for a reading. And then I met him when he landed up at Chennai, and we had this meeting, and then he disappeared for a year. Now I know why. So seeing, it's very good to hear him, but I would request, having had the experience of most of my reports being used as, convenient pillows, the census reports, for example, I would say please do read it. And all the in science you have a thing called lab to the land. Now this has to go to the actual policy makers, and they have to use it. And that is the real value of what Professor Karthik has put in. His hard work, his toil, his sweat, his tears. I think it will bear fruit only when it sees some of what Mr. Rao said in the practical space. It has to see conversion. And I wish that, most of my colleagues in the policy making space do read this. And I suppose you would be taking it to various forums where they would read. So I wish you all the best and thank you on behalf of the Chennai International Center. I thank Mr. Rao for having coming down and participated in the discussion, Mr. Ravi for very ably conducting this proceedings, and of course Professor Karthik for being with us here today and introducing his magnum opus. Thank you very much. Uh, just some housekeeping announcements. We do have a break till the elections, and after that we'll again resume. We have two interesting books coming up for discussion. In fact, three. One, we have Dr. Soumya here. There is a book on her which we will be bringing to all of you very soon. We also have Ambassador Mohan Kumar coming down on his latest book, and Ambassador Vijay Gokhale again on his latest book on China. So we'll be in touch with all of you. If some of you have not given us your coordinates, please leave your coordinates with Shabri or with Sudhakar, and we'll get back to you on the exact dates of these programs. Please do continue to support CIC as we move along to our own premises, which we hope will be ready in about a year's time. Thank you very much for being here today.